to today's webinar, where we talk about clean air and NOx emission from vehicles as announced. I will give some first notice to kick off this webinar. The webinar will be recorded. You can ask your questions in the Q&A box. Please be aware it's two possibilities. There is a chat and a Q&A. Only in the Q&A will be answered or handled upon the time that we have. Questions can be upvoted. As already said, we limit the Q&A to 5 or 5 questions, depending our schedule. And afterwards, you will all receive the link, inclusive the available presentations of the speakers by email. Furthermore, every speaker is speaking on behalf of their own findings or organization and does not necessarily represent the views or policies of AVERE or its individual participants. And that brings me to a short introduction about our own organization. For those that are not familiar with AVERE, AVERE is a member organization already active since '78 with a clear vision on how e-mobility should look into the future. We are typically a member organization, so we have from origin associations as members representing European countries. Currently that we represent 20 states, but we also have direct industry members. So with all this, we represent 2,400 direct and indirect industry organizations or companies and over 100,000 EV users as well. And this brings me automatically to an updated AVERE vision paper that we have launched today, how we should achieve 100% electrification by 2030 or reaching out carbon neutrality by 2050. It's of course also highly on the agenda from the European Commission, but yeah, coming back to this vision paper, what is it about? And why are we aiming for carbon neutrality? Why want we to do decarbonization of transport? And therefore, I would like to kick off this webinar with a short introduction movie. And then we go immediately to our first speaker. Here we go. 1 second. Have to do it from the beginning. Here we go. It ended with a rhetoric question, quite important, and automatically brings us to our first speaker of today, Roel Gijsbers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Can you give your introduction yourself?
Yeah, I will. I'll start sharing my screen.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
and I can confirm that visible.
Yeah, that's fine. That's perfect. Well, the video actually showed quite a severe situation, but also some hopeful messages. I think that's also a bit of the same as in my presentation. I titled it, "What does the end of the Ice Age mean for urban air quality?" Or for air quality in general. First, I introduce myself. My name is Roel Gijsbers. I'm a project and development engineer working at ENS Cleanair, which is a Netherlands-based company. We focus on the development and the application of innovative air treatment technologies. And today I would like to give you background about air quality in general, the focus on particulate matter that we have specifically, the role it has towards health impact, but also measures to improve urban air quality. And obviously, electromobility is part of that, but there's more. So I have a focus on Europe in this presentation and on the Netherlands, because I can give you some numbers about that. And well, as you see in the map here, the Netherlands appears to be among the European champions of loss of life expectancy, and that's a bit maybe a bit odd because we are not leading in air quality concentrations or emissions. So what is the reason for that? What you see in the map is that the dark red areas are mainly highly industrialized urban areas. So that might be a reason for that, but there are more reasons why health impact exists to some extent in some areas. Well, in the Netherlands specifically, the average life expectancy is reduced by 12 months due to, well, as it says, particulate matter, PM2.5. And of course, there are numerous adverse health effects related to air pollution, and especially related to the more vulnerable part of the population, so children, the elderly, and the people with underlying diseases. And this map of the Netherlands on the right shows the actual burden of disease caused by environmental factors. And it clearly shows you where the hotspots are. You can see the very dense road network, but also the big cities pop up here. And it's interesting to see that of all the indicators for disease in general, about 30% of those can be pinpointed. The other part is based on genetics or unknown, but that 30% actually is caused by behavior or the environment. And in the Netherlands, it appears that environmental factors have about 4 to 14% impact on this burden of disease, which is actually the second largest factor. And next to, well, smoking is first, and then comes in the environment. And of that impact, 75% is related to air pollution. And the other 25% is mainly sound. Well, as the video of the World Economic Forum showed, in the Netherlands, we also have a plan towards 2030. It's called the Cleanair deal, and it says we want to have 50% health gain in 2030. And the idea is to reduce that by mainly focusing on the emissions. So what actually is generated in our own country, focusing on mobility, machinery, agriculture, the usual suspects, so to say. And there is a specific focus. We have a specific focus on particulate matter. And the reason why, because of the impact it has. We specifically speak about particulate matter below the size, or actually particulate matter, as it says, is a mixture of solid and liquid particles suspended in the air. Nowadays, everybody speaks about aerosols. Everybody knows what aerosols are. In fact, these are the same as particulate matter. And we speak specifically about particulate matter below the size of 10 micrometers. So these are really tiny particles, largely invisible to the eye, which contain a mixture of natural and man-made substances. It can be organic or inorganic. And it is known that the smaller these particles are, the further they penetrate into your body when you inhale them. And even the smallest ones can enter the bloodstream directly through the alveoli. It is known that the health impact of PM 2.5, so the particulate matter smaller than 2.5 micrometer, is approximately 7 times higher than the health impact of nitrogen dioxide. And it shows in this table also. The effects of air pollution can slowly manifest themselves over years, and in some cases instantly. And of these three pollutants, we have PM, we have NO2 and O3, which is ozone. Clearly the particulate matter has the most impact. And in both health categories. So we talk about premature death and years of healthy life lost. And it's also known there's a direct correlation to the PM concentration and the incidence and severity of disease cases. So an increase directly leads to more health impact. Apart from health impact, also, particulate matter is the main contributor to the cost of health impact, and those are morbidity, premature mortality, but also secondary effects, so loss of production of workers, such things, loss of economic income, and what is important is that emissions are not the only factor in this health damage. Actually, emission leads to exposure, and exposure in the end leads to health damage. And exposure is actually the combination of behavior but also the environment. That behavior can be largely influenced. The environment can most of the times cannot be influenced. And here you see some factors that play a role, especially in the urban environment. It's not only traffic or wood burning or industrial size. It's also the actual geography. The majority of the air pollution comes from abroad, and it enters the city due to weather influences. But also urban planning plays a big role. If you have narrow streets, air pollution concentrations can really build up because the wind cannot freely clean them. And of course, there's policy, which is important. So already a lot of gain has been made in the form of local mitigation measures and source measures like electric mobility. The question then is, how do we value clean air? We know that there is a big impact. We know that it will cost money, but how much money does it cost? And especially the long-term effects on health are very harmful, but also very costly. For the Netherlands alone, these costs are estimated at 40 billion euros a year. And in the table on the right, you see some major cities in Europe and the absolute social cost as a result of air pollution. So for London, the greater city, 11 billion euro. And the cost per capita, so per person, in average is on 1,250 euros. So you can do the math yourself for the whole of Europe. And this is equivalent to about 4% of European GDP. So it's a substantial part of the money that goes around. Well, a very actual topic. Recent studies suggest that long-term exposure to PM 2.5 is associated with higher COVID-19 mortality rates, and that's interesting. What we have seen is that the exposure to the long-term exposure to air pollution really increases the risk of infection and the spread of viruses, and particulate matter specifically can serve as a carrier for these kind of pathogens. What we also know is that if you can treat the air like we do, it's possible to inactivate and even remove airborne particles and to make sure that we can lower the risk of infection. And actually COVID-19 also provided a very unanticipated but very interesting experiment on a worldwide scale, especially for the topic we are speaking about today, because we went in lockdown. And what this the title here, lockdown is the end. Is lockdown the end of the ice age? What was really important, everybody in lockdown, that there was not so much traffic anymore, and also industrial plants were shut down, and that is clearly visible also. Here you see two maps of Europe. This 2 years, 2019, 2020, comparable meteorological circumstances. And you see a clear a decrease of the NO2 pollution levels. Focusing on the Netherlands, it becomes even more clear. These are some pictures from the Dutch Royal Meteorological Institute. And well, these images were here all over the news. So you see what happens when people stay at home. And that's quite interesting. Of course, the scientists immediately grabbed these data, and what we saw that well, this is specifically for the United Kingdom, this example, but it showed that the average traffic counts were decreased with almost 70%, and it showed a really distinct decrease also on NO2 concentrations, about 40%. But for PM and also for ozone, it was less substantial. And that's interesting. To give you an idea of the influence of road transport, where we speak about today, on the emissions in the European Union. You have to look at the gray elements in the table. You see that especially on the nitrogen dioxide, it has a really large contribution at 39%. BC, black carbon or soot, also more than 25%, but on the particulate matter it's a bit less, around 10%. It should be noted that in urban environments, this percentage can be higher. Locally, even up to 30%. I saw figures of 50% also, and that's very dependent on the situation. So if you then compare what has been achieved so far, because there's policy towards cleaner mobility, this is a graph of elemental carbon emissions, and you see that these significantly have been reduced over the years. If you look at the orange elements of the graph, you see that is the elemental carbon emissions as a result of the exhaust emissions of vehicles, and by 2030. This component, which is a component of particulate matter, is minimized. And that's good news, I think, because elemental carbon is one of the most severe substances for health. And as you can see, by phasing out combustion engines towards 2030, a big difference is made. If we then look a bit more closely to these internal combustion engines that are part of our ice age, you see that there has been already over the years a substantial improvement on the exhaust emissions, on PM, but also on soot or carbon. But if we look at you clearly see it in the difference between the Euro 2 and the Euro 5 engines. There's a big leap forward. But if you look at the non-exhaust emissions, so that is brake wear, tire wear, resuspension, the difference, there's actually not much difference. So this also shows that at the moment, the majority of what is emitted by a vehicle with internal combustion engine is a non-exhaust emissions also. Of course, there's still room for improvement, which can be achieved with the electrical vehicles. So electrical vehicles have no exhaust emissions. On particulate matter, and also of course, no nitrogen dioxides. But the non-exhaust emissions, there's not so much. There's actually a little bit of tire wear, road wear, resuspension. They even score a little bit higher than the combustion engines. On brake wear, I see 0. I think that's mainly because the electrical vehicles can brake on the engine. And if you sum that up, you see a slight difference, which is mainly, which shows that on PM, the contribution of electrical vehicles is not so great. Of course, see that completely separately from nitrogen dioxides and also from carbon. So what does the end of the ice age then mean in general? An increase of electrical vehicles, which can be clearly seen in this graph. If you look at the orange bars, because there's a decrease in exhaust emissions, but also over the years there's an increase in road transport. So we see that the different types of mobility do not have a large impact on non-exhaust emissions. And because of the increase of road transport vehicles, you see an increase in this component. Still, there's a decrease overall, which is very good. Have to be, of course, that's a very good development, of course. But you see an increase still in the non-exhaust emissions. So the question is, what is do we eventually, by this measure only, lead to a healthy environment? The current effect of air quality measures based on policy is focusing on monitoring behavioral change, sustainable mobilities, redesign of the public space. It's a palette of measures that combined will result into hopefully a healthy environment and to 50% health gain in 2030. Especially electric mobility is or low emission zones, for example, a very good step to reduce local emissions, especially with regard to nitrogen dioxides and elemental carbon. And what we also see is greening, so the implementation of plants, of vegetation, which has a lot of advantages, but on cleaning the air is not really effective, and even it's sometimes counterproductive because it will block the natural flow in street gangs, for example. So if you look at the urban clean air strategy, and now we're coming also a bit more in our territory, we think source treatment is very important, and certainly the first line of defense, because we can focus on local emissions. Public transport is stimulated, behavior change is stimulated, will also always lead to health improvement. But we also know that the majority of the particulate matter, specifically, which is the main, the main component for health impact, is imported and originates from outside of the city. And in the literature, it's called like the blanket of particulate matter that comes into the city. And how can you act to that exposure if you cannot control it locally with source measures? And a few things can be done, of course. You have to reduce exposure, and analog to the energy transition, we believe that a combination of solutions is needed. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, of course, and every solution, specific solution, has a context-specific optimal application. There are always multiple factors of influence, and as a second line of defense, or a second factor in this whole strategy, the idea is to reduce exposure. Mainly at public hotspot locations. By intervention strategies, you can introduce low emission zones, which is of course not an actual source measure. You can reroute traffic, but then still the emissions are placed elsewhere. Or you can apply mitigation measures. These can be natural, like the vegetation, which have a little, but they have an effect, or they can be technical with solutions like we provide. But they have to be implemented well. That's very important. And we aim therefore for smart integration of this treatment technology to locally reduce this exposure. We do that with a technology. It's called positive ionization. It functions. It captures fine dust or particulate matter by treating the active airflow with an electric field. And in our machines, we then can capture the fine dust by directing into a certain collector surface. And in the end, this particular matter agglomerates into a visible powder, so to say, when you clean the machines, and the fine dust is really eliminated. The approach that we have is called Lungs of the City. And the idea behind that is that if you integrate active air treatment well, and you do it in existing infrastructural facilities, you have some tools to really focus on specific hotspot areas to reduce the exposure. And here are some examples of applications. For example, we apply this in underground parkings. We have already ventilation there. There's a source of air pollution, and these locations are also always in city centers, and always near quite crowded areas. Same goes for public transport hubs, metro stations, bus terminals, some kind of public buildings, can be street furniture. Tunnels is a very good example, especially in the dense urban area. And to show you what effect it can have, also research has been done. And the idea is, if you integrate such measures well, on top of all the other kind of measures, you can really improve specific situations in the city where other measures do not have enough effect. And in the end, we try to achieve a cumulative effect. So we'll show you the principle. For example, this is a generic city center. You see a computer simulation of airflows in it. And that's a metro line with 3 metro stations. where you can apply the technology. But there are also a number of underground parkings in this city center. So also these zones will be cleaned. And thirdly, we could provide all bus stops or bus stations with such technology. And therefore you can get this more overall effect and get a significant reduction citywide. This approach has been introduced, I think, 5 years ago. And since then we have applied a lot of, the technology in a lot of situations, and also did research to see how we can visualize the effect, measure the effect, and validate the effect. We did effect studies in car parks, metros, but also in urban scales, like you see here. And in the end, now 5 years later, we have seen that that the solution can be really effective if the results can be combined. I will not go into detail. In this case, please read the scientific papers about it. The links are in the PowerPoint. But we saw, for example, there's an example of a street canyon also in the city, but that we were able to reduce PM levels up to 50% at certain cases in the street. So that's quite an enormous difference. And finally, whatever you take from the city, you can also give back. This is an example of a development project that we are doing right now, where we actually are returning the captured fine dust back into the city in a sustainable manner by including it into the glaze of tile work. It's of course architecturally nice feature, but it's also durable because it's ceramic and it has a very, very long lifespan. This is something that will be presented later this year. So that is my take on urban or air quality in general, and the role of the electric mobility and the measures in general to them.
Thank you very much. Glad to see your insights on this. I found some remarkable points in your presentation. You said, indeed, the value of clean air. It's quite costly, and you see these links with these major cities. Then you indeed wonder why cities are not doing more actively something with it. I guess there is a progress that we have seen now last years. London was on the top of your list, but London is also having very green ambitious. Is it already visible or not yet? Or you don't know? You can.
Specifically for London, do you mean?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about London actually.
No.
I know that. I know, for example, that Paris. That we are involved there in the development of the Olympic Village. I know that air quality and the impact of exposure is really a big topic there. So it's well integrated in the development plans. So that's, I think, a very promising step forward.
Yeah. What I found also remarkable, and that was quite visible present in your presentation, is the visible powder from your filter system. What is inside? Do you notice any difference between where you have your filters installed by city, or even in different locations in the cities?
Yeah, definitely. We can see. Actually, the dust that we collect is the colors range from mostly brown to black, pitch black, and you can see differences. You can definitely see differences. For example, when we install this in for example, in a car park, which is in the middle of a building area, the dust in the first month is gray, for example. So then you can see that you mostly have building dust. It contains also different kind of elements than the pitch black kind of dust, which is more than 50% organic, carbon related. So yeah, that's we can see that, and we can also see the effectiveness of devices compared to their location. So if we position them really close to a very a place with more intense traffic, then we catch a lot more pollution. So you see that these local effects are clearly visible. Yeah.
So actually, these filters don't lie. What the bucket, the dust in the bucket is actually what we normally are breathing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's if people see it for the first time, also in reality, it's mostly an eye opener.
Yeah, it definitely is. I got one question from the audience here. Do you work together with local governments or cities to actively clean the air? And what are the outcomes of this?
Yeah, we do. We do in several countries and locations. And what is the outcome? Well, the outcome shows it's not citywide, of course. We're taking small steps, and as I shown in the lungs of the city approach, you need a lot of these small steps to get this cumulative effect. And but what we clearly see, and what we also have measured in certain areas, is that if you can clean, for example, in a car park, the indoors with to a certain extent, the air that you emit from the car park is actually cleaner than the air that goes in. So you clean the emissions inside, but also a part of the background concentration, and that means that part of that you actually do more than local emissions, and that's why I think it's beneficial to include also technical mitigation measures to the toolbox for policymakers.
So if you create clean air all over, no emission anymore from transport, your filters are not
abundant. No.
Not abundant, or should be abundant.
No, definitely. That's why I think the main message is there's not one solution to it. It's a set of solutions. Electromobility is a very important one, and there are much more. Yeah.
Of course. It's of course a chain reaction as well. We have to look at the total picture. This brings me automatically to our next speaker, who gives, my understanding, a broader aspect of pollution. Welcome, Kristian. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that was really interesting because I've seen firsthand the effects of this sort of pollution, and it's quite amazing, to be honest with you, to see the kind of levels of pollution that you'll find in these places like parking garages or tunnels. Just for everyone else's information, my name is Kristian Lande. I'm co-founder of AirVeraCity, which is a clean tech startup whose goal is to address air pollution through the digitization of the local environment. So I will take you through a few slides, and at the end, I'm going to show you also, I think, which is relevant for your listeners, viewers, how this could help to sell electric vehicles. This approach could help to sell electric vehicles. So how do you address climate change? That's a big question, right? Well, we see air pollution as a surrogate for climate change. And the reason is because if you look at the history of air pollution events, when the problem is visible, there's an always overwhelming consensus at dealing with that problem. I mean, all these historical events, by the way, have had significant and lasting policy changes, which I think is very important just because of the visualization. For instance, London fog, that really did lead to the creation of the global LNG market. And in the 60s, what happened in LA with the smog led to the Clean Air Act and later to the first emissions markets. And finally, in China's experience, we've seen a dramatic effect in terms of the lowering of costs of wind and solar. You know, as an energy trader, which is part of my background, speculative energy trader, I've seen this firsthand. And the policies brought forward by the Chinese national government really enabled these technologies to become competitive without a subsidy. And the solar price.
Allow me to interrupt you, but your presentation is not in full
okay.
white mode. It's half.
Okay, let's see. Let's try it again.
It allows us to see a bit more details. No,
does that work better?
No, it's still the same.
Okay, let's try it again. Of course, it would be an IT thing that tips me out.
Something more than that. It's.
How about that? Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So, you know, the interesting thing here really is the fact that, you know, these changes have come about irrespective of which government was involved. I think I was just leading off with China. You know, the price of solar panels dropped by about 80% in 12 years. And the really interesting thing is that batteries are essentially following the same trajectory, but maybe 10 years behind solar panels. And this is all related to their reaction, the national government's reaction to air pollution and the investments they made in the 5-year plan of $757 billion to address that and to build wind and solar. But the, you know, like I said, the thing with the politics side of it is really interesting because when it's visible, it doesn't matter really who's in power. So for instance, in Milan in 2008, you had the EcoPass, which was a traffic management congestion zone, and it was implemented by a right-leaning government. And you might find that difficult to believe when you know that Milan has one of the highest percentages of car ownership in Europe, but it also is very ill-suited to air pollution. So the Po Valley is sort of, you know, encompassed by mountains, low winds, a lot of temperature inversions in the wintertime. And then you have agricultural, ozone, and industrial that plays a real critical role to making that pollution visible. So this is how you kind of able to garner support. And from that, this is, you know, the lessons I've taken from that, I'm applying here. So, you know, the problems with air pollution really are ones of complexity and collaboration. So air pollution is complex, you know, it's hyper-local, it's often not visible, it's highly influenced by weather. Urban air pollution can vary by as much as 8 times within 200 meters, but, you know, for the average person, it just kind of goes unrecognized. So the question really becomes, how do you get people to collaborate when they can't accurately define the problem? And the problem here is that the existing air pollution maps are largely a mirage. They're based on a single point, looking back, maybe averaging over an hour. And, you know, they don't really give you actual information, which has limited value for most people. And then you have some commercial applications too, which make them more interesting to see. But again, the underlying data behind that, again, is a single point. Oftentimes, it's weather, which has a sort of resolution for most weather forecasts on a 10-kilometer grid, which, you know, just doesn't give you the kind of information you really need. I mean, the reality is more about what we did here in Lausanne, where you were able to measure every single segment of the city and measure it in real time. I mean, the previous approaches, you know, really haven't worked. It's sort of the quote that was sort of attributed to Einstein about, you know, being insanity, doing the same thing over, expecting different results. So actually, more appropriately, it's related, that quote is actually from Alcoholics Anonymous. and it kind of is appropriate in terms of air pollution, because we spend something like 6.5% of GDP on transport. I think the worldwide we spend something like almost 9% on fuel subsidies, mainly fossil fuel subsidies. And if you look at Europe, and you think to yourself, okay, well, we're spending 9.5% for transport, which I think is the number for Europe, and you look at it for the air pollution controls, you're spending 0.4%. So we're really not doing much. And then when you look at the the number of traffic deaths like we had last year, 18,000 versus the number of air pollution, which is well over 400,000. Just really not consistent in the sense of you know, where we should allocate things. But I'm not looking, I don't think there's a simple solution like your previous speaker was speaking about, and it's true, it's not. What you do have to do is you have to change the dynamic. You have to, people act differently in large groups than they do small. You have to make it localized. So what we have here with these air pollution sensors, these low-cost air pollution sensors, is massive growth in them. The municipal IoT-enabled market is growing at 25.4% a year. And to put that in perspective, you know, the only other markets that I know really growing at these kind of rates are maybe something like the e-bus, you know, which you're seeing about, according to McKinsey Consulting, seeing about an 18% annualized growth through 2030. These things actually surpass that because people want the information. And a great example of that is this government-funded program that came out of Stuttgart. And it started with 300 sensors. And at the end of the program, it continued where they were actually over 12,000 with no budget. I mean, this is real grassroots demand. No budget, no advertising, but just a massive demand for that, right? And now they measure something like over 7 billion measurements, 75 countries. So, you know, it's the interest is definitely there, and you really see it in Asia. And part of that is because when people see it, they visualize it, they actually want to know, hey, you know, what is it? The ERC came out in 2017 and said, you know, these things potentially could be a game changer with how we deal with air pollution, but really we have to be able, you know, to address this issue of accuracy. And that's what the group I'm with has done. And the solution essentially is the networking of personal air pollution sensors. You know, they say it's really the key. And they say the first technological revolution was the internet where people were connected. The next one's going to be the devices. And there's something like 42.5 billion devices they're expecting to be connected by 2025. But this has real value for what we're trying to accomplish because we're trying to use what's worked in the past. And what's worked in the past has been the air quality monitoring stations. They're highly accurate, but they're just really expensive and they require a lot of resources. But we could lever those to network all air pollution sensors so you would know exactly the accuracy of every single measure through the method that we've developed. And this chart here is really showing you it's kind of it's more generic to the telecommunications industry, but it's called Metcalfe's law. And essentially, it's showing you the value of the network going up with proportional to the square of the number of users. So how do you make something that's relatively cheap electromechanical device as accurate as a highly complex set of lab equipment? You know, the thing on the left is your official reference station. That's what we have now. These things are, you know, it's a lab equipment. It's 150,000 euros at least. It's highly accurate, over 90% accurate. You know, you need professionals to maintain it, professionals to calibrate it. Then you have these electromechanical devices, you know, which the equivalent one there costs less than 7,000. And how do you make those roughly equivalent to the other ones? And the way we do it is we do it through a process of calibration where we're calibrating things. And again, it's the IoT concept of basically connecting devices to devices, having those devices speak to each other and share algorithms essentially. And that was done through, this was advanced. Okay, so how it was done and how it was developed was of course 6 years, 7 labs, 5 million francs, Switzerland funded project, part of which was here in Lausanne in Switzerland, had 10 buses operating normally for 3 continuous years, 800 million measurements. And from that, really, we could tell that you could achieve on a consistent basis indicative values. And indicative in air pollution circles is sort of a regulatory defined by pollutant, say 70% accurate or more, where the regulatory, the main stations are looking for 90% or more. But if you can get 70% accurate or more, then you have something that's really cool, because most people don't realize is when you buy these things out of the box, they might not even be 50% effective. But you know, it's a relative thing. So if you're 50% accurate in an environment that's varying by 800%, it could do what you want it to do, but maybe not with the kind of accuracy that you know, the regulatory requirements would require. So this is based, like I said earlier, on a dynamic DAISY, one of the techniques. Okay, so there's many things that were developed here, but one of the biggest ones. And by the way, you would never see this in any other industry. This only kind of thing could only occur in air pollution, which is sort of, this, because there's not an economic signal, let's be honest. It's a negative externality. But the way the dynamic daisy chaining calibration technique works is that the vehicles will pass within close proximity to each other, sample the same air. This is a reference station which our vehicle passed by, communicate with that device, and send a bunch of different variables to the device, including, how far away it is, the weather variables, the cross sensitivities of the different air pollutants you're measuring, and you'll come up with an accuracy figure. So our goal here really is to work within the system and say, look, we want to expand the existing air quality network. Because what I don't want to see happen is what I saw happen in China when I was trading LNG and coal. And that was that the government takes a misstep, and no matter what they do from that point on, no one trusts them. And even when I talk to people now who actually own these sensors and actually work for the government, they don't trust their own government. And I think that's a real slippery slope, and it's a sound of slippery slope we've seen with other technologies. So yeah, that was that. Then, okay, so Dieselgate, right? First day, first trial, we take, we see evidence of it, right? So it's the classic thing that we've all read about. It's the defeat device. And the kind of crazy thing there really is that, it's reportedly that it was well known that these things existed and that the emissions were much higher than what is the real world conditions. And you guys have written papers on that, and they're really interesting to read. If people get a chance, I encourage them to read those. And what we found was just that it was just so blatantly obvious, right? If it was well known to people, it certainly wasn't well known to the people who are buying the vehicles, right? With the intent of buying something that was 20% less CO2 emitting, but not realizing that it had 20 times more pollutants. And I don't think that's really, obviously it's easy to point fingers at the car industry and stuff like that, but I tend to point a finger more at myself because why did that exist? Well, it existed because it's a negative externality and the incentives aren't right. So the incentive mechanism is to kind of play the game. People play the game. And even now, I think with the RDE, they came in with the European Union rules saying, like, we're going to, put an end to this with some real world development. Yeah, maybe, you could always, if you know what the test is, you can generally game the test. So here's one of the things they're doing. One of the things other people developed in what the European Union is doing is they have this reference level equipment in specially kitted vehicles. Well, first of all, again, that's not cheap, right? So these things are 125,000 euros, and it's especially calibrated. So is it more effective? Big open question mark. Then when you look at, like, for instance, just this kind of goes back to the earlier presentation, when you're actually in these vehicles and you see these events, it's just sort of amazing, you see the pollution levels kind of going through the roof in places that aren't even, no one would know, on parking garages, tunnels, and they're empty a lot of times. And you think, wow, this just wouldn't be, if this information was public, people would change their behavior. They would do something. And it doesn't have to be the government telling them. They can just act out of enlightened self-interest in many ways. So one of the solutions, and as I mentioned earlier, selling electric vehicles, one of the solutions here obviously is, using these LED lights and putting them on vehicles. And the reason you'd want to do that, obviously, maybe if you had public transport, it could increase the ridership. The combination of this technology and the one that we were describing earlier on a bus would show people, this is, better to get in the bus and take the transport than to be outside of it. The simple idea of making the air quality index, going back to the idea of complexity, making the complex simple: red, bad, green, good. And why it might sell vehicles is the sort of Prius effect, what they call the green halo effect. This is sort of like a green halo squared effect, where you would actually be driving around in your vehicle. People would look to you as a service to the community and see the light on the car, encouraging the sale of that car and encouraging your green credentials. So it's sort of like the idea of the Prius, but even more so, because you are really providing a true service to your community. And for the people with the background in economics, that really gets into the whole Maslow's hierarchy and the sort of esteem being derived from locality. So these are some of the simple solutions you can do. Other solutions that we've seen too that are actually working much better now are things like community enforcement. We see this in New York City. They've had an idling ban in the city since '72, and it wasn't enforced really at all for 40 years, and then 45 years, and then they came along and said, look, we're going to allow people to enforce this. So you see your truck idling in Manhattan, you can take a video of it, send it in, and you get 25% of of the penalty, which could be up to $250. These kind of things, could be applied if you have the air pollution sensors. But equally, there's the whole idea of avoidance. If there's high concentrations of air pollution, you can often avoid them, which is critical. And more importantly, we have problems, like right now, if you look at the European Union, we have the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which has done a great job in terms of lowering overall emissions in combination with the Chinese, lowering the cost. But it hasn't happened for transport, right? So engine efficiency has increased maybe 50% in 20 years, but the number of car sales kept going up. And a simple idea, and one that is definitely doable, would be to use this network to incorporate that trading scheme into the auto and building sector. And obviously this requires a combination of different data sources, but when you look at it from a city level, the existing city level emission inventories often have uncertainty levels of 50, 60, 80%. If you're talking about uncertainty levels of 10, 20%, you could allocate emissions not to vehicles, but to cities, and the cities can manage that exposure. And that, I think, is really important for the EU, because there's just no way that you're not going to get into a trade difficulty with the WTO through a border carbon tax. And then this exists. It's based on a standard, which is really important because, a lot of work has been done on that. A lot of the expertise is there. And, for industry, I think it's important too, because it isn't really fair that the industry, that you could buy something from a cheap producing country and not, nobody pays any of the emissions taxes on that at all. And that really does put some industries at a competitive disadvantage. So you really do need to include the transport and building sector, especially if you want to achieve the goals, into this. And okay, and then finally, road pricing, right? Road and congestion pricing. This is the one I kind of love because it's the one I know best. And this is sort of the point-to-point, congestion charge. So doing something similar to this with traffic congestion in Singapore, but I think the problem really you get into is that any sort of congestion zone is going to have some serious problems, right? So a flat tariff congestion zone has a problem. Classic case in London, Uber driver driving his diesel taxi all around all day within the zone, only pays one time. Very wealthy individual just crosses the border, but he's indifferent, doesn't cost, or she's indifferent, doesn't cost, whatever it costs, doesn't matter, make a lot of money. So this is different in the sense it's a use piece, and all the technology is there. It just needs to be put together. And then the idea would be that you would have a point-to-point congestion charge. You pay for traffic congestion, and a point-to-point pollution charge, which you would pay for pollution. And more importantly, is you could get paid. So if you're relieving congestion, just like the other structures that work and have been used for many years to bring you your essential commodities like electricity. In electricity, if you flow power the opposite direction, you get paid. This would be the similar thing. If you relieve traffic congestion by going, exiting, leaving a parking spot, moving out of the city, you get paid. And same thing with the air pollution. If you're driving a vehicle, especially one with pollution reduction equipment, you're getting paid. So it commoditizes a negative externality. And well, in the case of London, you also avoid the issue or any major city of embassies not paying, because this is no longer a tax, which even they recognize it as a tax, and that's why people are against it. Oftentimes, we've seen it a number of times. I believe Rotterdam, Edinburgh, other places like that, Manchester. But it's actually a true market price, which people can get paid. So it gets around some of the inequality issues too. And the fact that it's located in cities also gets around some of the rural inequality issues. But all these things are there, they just need to be done. And to do that, again, goes back to the second issue, which is collaboration. You need to work within the existing framework to make it happen. And that's what we're trying to do as a company, work with the air quality authorities on behalf of air quality authorities to bring this to people, galvanize that grassroots demand into something positive using the existing frameworks that there. Because at the end of the day, you know, the government is you. And to do this, you know, you just need to change the dynamic, you need to change the way we approach these things. And then obviously, you know, these people, a lot of these people kind of influence my thinking. But the one, maybe the more relevant one is, I think, is Bloomberg said that the easiest and most effective way to reduce air pollution is to measure it. And that's what we're trying to bring to cities. And to be honest, you know, I think the attitudes are changing in cities, because generally cities are somewhat a victim in some ways of these things, because they are looked to solve it, but they didn't create it. And when you first approach a city and say, look, you know, we have this great solution, it scares them, because when you see the reality of the pollution in your street and how concentrated it can become, yeah, it scares me. You know, I'm driving, so I'm not surprised. But that's what we're trying to do, and that's how we want to change the world, essentially.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your conclusion. Definitely. It's quite remarkable, if I'm allowed to ask you the question. So, yeah, you indeed started with the point air pollution is complex, and the easy way to show it is also bring it to the people. So engaged with the citizens, engaged with the people to measure them. What are we scared of? Why is it not happening?
Well, complexity is a big one, right? You know, what you see in many cities, like you see in Paris, and you've seen in other cities in China, in Beijing, is the measurement of PM, right? So that they're able to do measurement of PM relatively easy because it's a laser based, whereas the gaseous ones aren't. And I think for the complexity piece, you really need the air quality index. That's the first piece. But the second piece too is, you put yourself in a city manager's position. All of a sudden, there's going to be somebody showing up and showing you how many problems you're going to have. And if you look, and this is one of the things I asked myself, because when I came into this industry, I'm like, why does all this exist? This is crazy. You've had the technology for 10 years. But what happens is the incentives aren't aligned, right? So as a city manager, all of a sudden you have all these problems. And if you think about it from the air quality personnel, when you meet them, who are actually really on a personal level more enthusiastic about this technology, and that, assuming that you could prove the accuracy, than you would think, because that, you know, it's their specialty. You know, there's actually a science built up around how you actually, whether you're going to move that air quality station that you saw on the road 5 feet to the left or 5 feet to the right. So you can imagine how contentious the issues become when you already have those kind of fights. And then you have a startup saying, hey, look, we know these instruments will never be 100% accurate. We don't want them to be, but we will tell you exactly how accurate. And everyone will be engaged around that. And the city's reaction will be like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have so many problems with this. And what they don't realize, and I think what the governments don't realize, is that it's happening anyways. Just take the experiences I've seen in China, which are limited, but you know, you get 10 people saying the same thing. Generally, there's an element of truth to that. And that is the fact that people are taking the technology and creating their reality. So I think the real issue is one of coordination, you know, and it's also, I think it's also, it's a relic of the way we address these issues. You know, because again, people behave differently in large groups than they do small. When you could localize it, you can address it. But when it's a big thing, then it becomes a big fight, right? And then the subsidies go on one side and there's no subsidies on the other. Or let's say the lobby money goes to one side, but there's none on the other. You know, there's this general overall interest, but really everyone's interest is aligned once they see it affecting them directly. So I think it hasn't happened because no one's shown it. And when I look at some of the examples around the world where it's been done, there's always a reluctance on the behalf of the cities, oftentimes, to not keep it public. We want to know about the problem, we'll solve it. We don't want to keep it public. But that's, you know, I just don't think people are being mature about it and stepping up. And I mean citizens.
I have a question from the audience here. What are the typical polluted hotspots in cities based on your data? And what do you recommend city governments to do when this information is available?
Well, you know, the typical ones would be what you kind of see. What I think most people don't realize, and I certainly didn't realize, is what a huge difference obviously the weather. You know, when somebody explained to me how this thing worked, I said in 2 seconds, I said, well, that'll never work. in terms of how the existing framework works. I said, I can't tell you if it's raining on your doorstep. How can I tell you what the air pollution is? So I think the solution is radical transparency. What can the cities do? They can make it public, right? So if you had all this information in real time, you could have a city planner. You could have LED lights on the bus stop. You could have LED lights encouraging people to take alternative forms of transport. I mean, when you talk about 3.5% of GDP, I don't think people really understand how big a number that is. We're lucky to get a 0.5% GDP growth. When you start talking about the cost being 3.5% of GDP, it's an enormous number. So the first thing is be transparent. Make the information public. Let people who are highly sensitive, especially, avoid it. You can't avoid air pollution right now with the existing monitoring equipment because it's telling you what happened 2 hours ago, not what's happening right now. So I think that's really the key. It's the sort of radical transparency, but centralize that. Don't let everyone go out and create their own network and come up with their own, reality. Let's work together to have a single reality and then address it in that way. And the first step we could do is do avoidance. But, I can't tell, I do not believe that there's any silver bullet in these things. And I think every solution will be dependent upon the city. So I think those decisions making has to be decentralized and it has to be adaptable.
Okay, I got actually two statements, but it's maybe confirming from what you're quoting yourself. Stefan Horman said, yeah, UK Department for Environment are actually on record and saying PM reduction is too hard to do. Is it correctly?
Why? How? I mean, is it too hard to not burn a fire for Christmas? I mean, a lot of that stuff comes from decorative fires. Is it too hard to would you change your behavior if you knew it made a difference? Like if my neighbor could say, wow, what are you burning today? Oh, well, I'm just burning green wood versus wood pellets. Would it make a difference? Maybe not. Maybe I don't care what my neighbor thinks, but also maybe I do. And maybe, having that level of transparency would change my behaviors, encourage me to change my behaviors without having to, kick up a fight with the city. Now, maybe they mean that department can't do anything about it because they don't have the whatever wherewithal. But I think it's an impossible position to take on the other side, right? It's impossible to argue against transparency, I think. There's just no good arguments other than privacy. And we've solved that as well through blockchain.
Yeah, and it brings me back actually to our sector, the mobility sector. And I just came into the news right now that the EU ambassadors today decided not to compromise with European Parliament on setting an end date to allowable discrepancy between the lab and real driving emissions vehicle tests. So it's actually confirming what you're saying.
Well, look, I worked at Enron. You can game anything. If you have the right incentive structure, you cannot break the rules and still game it. And that's what Dieselgate was. From their perspective, I'm sure it was. You saw the evolution of that where other competitors realized what people were doing and thought, I'll do that too. You have to measure it. Otherwise, you're going to have gaming. Like we were saying earlier about the road tests. Okay, those road tests are now, under certain conditions. Can't be below -7, and other things like even on electric buses, we still have the diesel heaters, right? Oftentimes. So, but is anybody looking at that? Should they? Maybe they should. Maybe there should be a choice between CNG and diesel to heat the bus, because obviously, the technology is not there to run the whole bus and the heating system on the battery. But there are other solutions. But if people aren't given the information, it's hard for them to make that call.
I'm going to ask to both of you to conclude maybe today's webinar with the knowledge that you have about air pollution and the knowledge that on the Paris Agreement and the challenge we have, the end date by 2050. Are we still in time? Is it still feasible?
Yeah.
I think everything is feasible if you give it the right attention. And I think because I fully support the story of Kristian, I think if people are aware of what is actually around them, and they also made aware, then I'm sure that a lot of people will stand up, and then you have this kind of bottom-up approach, which is really necessary. Yeah? So it needs to be solved from two sides, I think.
There's a great comment from me, but there's another one from Volker I wanted to address. He said, the European areas are complying to the official regulations regarding PM2.5. Oh. And I think, well, to myself, I'm like, wow, what a low bar. That was set, when? I mean, most of them were set in 2005 based on maybe 2000 data. But also here in Switzerland, for many years, until 2 years ago, we didn't have measurements for PM2.5. Yeah. So it's a good observation, but I just think, our aspirations are too low.
But what I see in speaking to a lot of governmental organizations and cities, they are actually lowering the bar also. So it's not that they are what they say. We want to achieve the World Health Organization standards, which are half of the European standards, and that's a great leap forward. Of course, if we can achieve that in 2030, then we are already achieving the goal that is set, for example, in the Netherlands and by the EU.
Yeah, but I think in your studies, you made a really good example. Is like not everyone's affected the same way. So what you're doing, again, an average. It's the idea of the guy with his in the kitchen. He's got his head in the freezer and his feet in the fire. And someone says, "Well, how do you feel?" About average. It's really important that we measure it and give that information to people, so the people who are highly susceptible to it can avoid it, or, demand that we have cleaner air, or we need these things, and there's a market mechanism to provide them. If we like the thing from Cleanair, like this quote I had earlier about Cleanair saying, until the critical mass of informed citizens in our society, until we do that, until we inform them, we're always going to get away with gestures. And I think that's what we're dealing with right now, gestures. And we're setting the bar so low that we're looking like, hey, we finally settled what we thought we were going to do we thought we could do 20 years ago. So I think I think it's very different per individual. And I don't think that solution's worked in the past, and I don't think it'll work in the future. I think the information has to be transparent to everyone, and they can act out of enlightened self-interest. And then by doing so, it'll make it easier for policymakers to up those standards, because there'll be less pollution. Make it easy for them to say yes.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your insights. Really appreciate it. I hope we can conclude from here. I guess we can still discuss for many hours on this topic. But happy to have your insights and your contribution from today. Also want to conclude maybe with the own mission, or from AVERE itself. We want to go for zero emission transport, but it should be inclusive. It should be available for everyone, because air pollution has no borders, that's for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I look forward to see you in our next webinar on the AFIT. Subscription is still open. Feel free to follow us. Thank you very much for your attendance, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.